The United States has a very strange, almost biblical reverence for its Constitution. The so called Founding Fathers have been deified and are often depicted in a godly form. Any action that can even be perceived as going against their wishes is ruthlessly attacked as an affront to democracy and the Constitution itself. Even with the ratification of amendments, the original text remains unchanged for the most part. We're told that these were great heroes who fought bravely for freedom and democracy. But when it came to actually building a model for democratic governments, these godly figures kind of sucked. From poorly defined rights and duties, vague definitions, blatantly undemocratic provisions, and a general tendency to just kick issues down the road, the shoddy constitution that they wrote has actively held back our development as a modern nation and has served only to suppress those who stand in the way of capital. Now, before looking into the inherent flaws in the US Constitution, we have to understand the context under which it was drafted. You've probably heard the story in your history class. The new American nation, having just secured its independence, was now facing struggles with the decentralized Articles of Confederation. So brave delegates came together in Philadelphia to fix it, and the result was a new constitution of compromise and states' rights, and you get the idea. This idealized view of history leaves a lot out, though. While there were certainly flaws with the Confederation state, the main flaw that prompted the creation of this new constitution was that the Articles were just far too democratic. That's it. Above all else, it was the fear of a popular lower-class uprising against the economic tyranny of the upper classes, coupled with the general lack of centralized power to enforce the relations of private property, that drove delegates to Philadelphia to draft a constitution. After all, prior attempts to amend the Confederation had only garnered limited support. A convention for this exact purpose was held in Annapolis just 1 year prior, but it was only attended by about 5 state delegations. But after economic unrest among poor farmers culminated in an outright rebellion, all but one came to the table for a new convention. And contrary to the fanciful preamble you probably had to memorize in the 5th grade, this new constitution had no intention of serving we the people. It was explicitly written to strengthen the authority held by the ruling classes in American society. And nowhere is this more apparent than the fight over the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, and the decades of debates surrounding them, is what you get when you try to form a government with a group of entitled businessmen whose only point of agreement was that poor people should not have political power. Many of the delegates were entirely opposed to enshrining civil liberties in the Constitution. Main excuse being that, well, since there was no mechanism written into the Constitution that would allow for the violation of people's rights, there was no need to explicitly lay those rights out. There were also those who felt that the enumeration of specific rights would imply that other rights just didn't exist, even though the Constitution can be amended, and there was nothing that would have precluded the addition of more rights down the line. And these are the people we hold up as our great founding fathers? So anyway, they did what they were best at, a toothless compromise that kicked the issue down the road for someone else to solve, leaving us to deal with endless legal arguments over the implied and original intent of the founders. Thus, our civil liberties are tacked on as amendments to the Constitution, but not actually a main part of the Constitution itself. Kind of like the appendix of a textbook. Except instead of giving you useful information, it's just a bunch of arcane clauses that imply the existence of more information, which may not actually even exist in the first place. Well, let's get started. Starting off with the famous First Amendment. Cramming 5 rights into a single sentence certainly isn't the most coherent way of expressing what you mean, but hey, half the framers didn't even want it in the first place, so I guess it'll have to do. But if we look closer at the main text, we can see the amendment doesn't actually grant the rights to speech and religion, press, petition, assembly. It simply states that Congress shall make no law restricting these freedoms. And that's it. It's just on Congress making laws. You can be fired for expressions of speech or faith. The post office can blackball your news publication. Police can arrest you for assembling and protesting against the wrong thing in the wrong way. For example, BLM protests were met with violent military force, whereas armed right-wing extremists were escorted into the Capitol rotunda. Racial justice represents a threat to the dominance of capital, whereas Trump mobs are simply a sign of infighting among capital. So the next time someone asks you, what happened to our freedom of speech? You can remind them that it simply never existed. When Facebook bans you, it's not a sign of a communist plot to steal our liberties. They simply have no obligation whatsoever to respect those liberties. And aside from the actions of a few private companies, the US government itself has a very long history of disregarding free speech in favor of upholding the dominance of the ruling class and their capital. From the early Alien and Sedition Acts, which criminalized criticism of the administration, to the Espionage Acts, which criminalized anti-war speech during the First World War, to the various communist control acts at the height of the Red Scare, which criminalized membership in certain political parties. Free speech has never truly existed. And this issue of explicit rights seems to be a uniquely American problem. In nearly every other constitution I read in preparation for this video, these 5 rights are explicitly enumerated in the main text of the Constitution. Of course, these constitutions are more frequently updated, to save everyone the effort of bickering over the original intent of someone who died 200 years ago. Another great example is the controversial Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. It's been 230 years since its ratification, and no one can fully agree on what this one sentence actually means. The courts, legislators, and, well, pretty much everyone have gone back and forth on this for years. The common legal consensus from the courts seems to be more in line with the well-regulated militia part of the line, less so than the shall not be infringed part. And based on the history of this, I have to agree. The Constitution was prompted by fear of popular uprising in the aftermath of the Shays Rebellion. The arming of the masses against the state was the exact opposite of what the delegates wanted. But a strong, centrally regulated militia system would have been. It was the relative weakness of the existing militia system which allowed the unrest which led to the rebellion to spread and foment in the first place, as many of the militia members were also poor farmers sympathetic to the cause. Rather than being the people's guarantee against government tyranny, as many claim, it was more so meant to be the government's guarantee against exactly that. And indeed, we often see armed militia groups taking the side of the state during mass uprisings against state power, while groups that actively organize against violence are ruthlessly persecuted. And this was the case with the Black Panthers, who promoted community self-defense against state violence, which then prompted traditionally pro-gun Republicans to pass some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country. Laws which are now mocked by those same pro-gun Republicans. It's not about the right to self-defense, it's not about standing up to tyranny. It's just another means of enforcing the dominance of capital. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say on the Second Amendment. Have fun in the comments. Next, I want to talk about the Constitution's very interesting relationship with definitions, and that being the complete lack of any concrete definitions at all. Remember, this was written by a group of elites whose only point of agreement was that poor people suck, and so they had a general tendency to leave any disagreement or discrepancies for someone else to deal with down the line. They couldn't even figure out how to properly define the role of the court system, leaving the judiciary to basically grant itself judicial powers. The original intent of the framers is so opaque that the courts had to come up with the idea of qualified immunity to protect government officials who violate the Constitution without even knowing it. This was the case in Englund v. Carey, one of the only cases involving the Third Amendment's prohibition on the forced quartering of troops in people's homes. The courts found that the state's actions were indeed in violation of the Third Amendment, but since no case had ever properly defined the provision, the state had qualified immunity and could not be held accountable. Yup. And if you've ever watched The West Wing, you're probably familiar with the famous typo in reprints of the Constitution.
I read the Constitution. I think I found a typo. There's an inconsistent comma.
No.
So I looked at every English language publication that exists. Half of them have the comma, half of them don't.
An inconsistent comma in the Fifth Amendment, hinging on whether or not this marking is a comma or just a smudge. Some have argued that it completely changes the meaning of the Takings Clause, the legal foundation for eminent domain. But at no point has anyone suggested amending the Constitution to clarify this inconsistency. And same with other provisions with inconsistent or conflicting interpretations. We're told all the time that the Constitution is a living document that must adapt to changing times. But at the same time, we're ridiculed for suggesting just that. Anyone who dares suggest changes to the Constitution is vilified as an enemy of democracy. Before closing out this first part of my Why the Constitution is Shit series, I figured we could take a look at some rights that you may think you have, but actually don't. Like the right to vote. Yes, there are amendments that have extended the right to vote to certain people, but nowhere in the Constitution is the right of the people to vote in elections ever actually affirmed. Those amendments I mentioned, well, they don't exactly grant the right to vote either. If you read them, you'll see that they only state that the right to vote cannot be restricted solely based on factors of race, sex, poll tax, or age above 18. Restrictions for other reasons are not mentioned at all. So those stories we hear about purged voter rolls and ID laws and whatnot, that's all perfectly legal. Nothing in the Constitution prevents an arbitrary across-the-board revocation of voting rights. And if a state wanted to, say, bring back the old property requirements for voting, nothing in the Constitution to tell them otherwise. Why do you think the Electoral College exists? No, it has nothing to do with big states and small states or the cities and the rural areas and population differences. No, it all goes back again to the very simple fact that the framers of the Constitution didn't like poor people and didn't want them to vote for president. Simple as that, there's no debate to be had here. And on the flip side, there's also no guaranteed right to stand for election for public office either. The Constitution may lay out requirements for who is eligible to be a representative or senator, like, age and residency, but there's no provision which positively guarantees the right to be a candidate. So the two ruling parties are free to pass restrictive ballot access laws that make it all but impossible for a candidate outside of those parties to even run in the first place. Now, I could go on, but, we'd be here for hours. This is just a brief insight into the great illusion of liberal democracy under capitalism. In my next installment, we'll be diving into the actual main text of the Constitution to see the many ways in which the United States was deliberately and explicitly designed as the vanguard of capital at the expense of the masses. Until then.